Pastor Dylan, thank you for joining us again on the podcast today.
Chris, it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you.
Absolutely. We have two topics I wanted to go over today because there's a lot happening out there right now and a lot of news centered around all these new abortion laws that are trying to be passed all over the place. Some light in the darkness with some states, but certainly more darkness in other states than light, I would say. And we're just seeing this resurgence of what is abortion itself with Roe v. Wade is dark enough as it is with what we've been dealing with over the last 50 or so years. But seeing the types of stuff that people are advocating for now is getting to be very scary to me. I think we've gotten to this really interesting point in time where abortions used to be considered taboo. They always said, at least on one political side of the aisle and everything, that they should be safe but rare. Right. And I think what most people in the public really took from that is that as long as it's done early in the gestation period of a baby and everything, which still I disagree with, obviously, and everything, but the earlier the better, and that there's no problem with it. It's all about the woman's body and everything. But now some of these bills that we're seeing, especially with what happened in New York with Governor Cuomo and everything, they literally stood up in that meeting and celebrated the passing of legislation that allows for late-term abortions, meaning the third trimester, when, we're well past weeks of being able to survive outside of the womb at that point, because what is it, 24 weeks now that with technology, a baby can survive outside the womb. And we're talking about like 30 weeks and up and everything. But let's take a look real quick at the video of Governor Cuomo celebrating with them passing the legislation for late-term abortions here.
The bill was first introduced in 2007 and removes abortion from the state criminal code and ensures women the right to an abortion in New York, should that federal right ever be changed by the Supreme Court. But Cuomo thinks it should be taken a step further.
And do a constitutional amendment so no governor, no legislator, no political swing can ever jeopardize a woman's right to control her own body in this state.
The New York State Catholic Conference and Bishop Robert Cunningham are strongly opposed to the bill, saying New York is moving in the wrong direction by empowering more doctors to provide abortions and removing all state restrictions on late-term procedures.
Okay, so Pastor Dylan, what are your thoughts on all this right off the bat?
Well, right off the bat, I am drawn to the fact that this is more of a fraudulent game than it has ever been an honest conversation for a lot of people. Many of these people, they had a lot of surface level language and ways they wanted to cover and sugarcoat things. But I think what we're just seeing is that the thin layers that covered up what this issue really are now being gone. It never was about women's rights. And again, I think the whole premise of setting up women versus men is a fraudulent thing to do to start with. These people claim to be interested in something akin to civil rights, but yet they keep perpetually doing things which are antagonistic to that end. So I think with the issue of abortion, there's been swaths of intellectual dishonesty or intellectual deficiency. And I'm always hesitant to say that people are out doing things that are just explicitly evil. But when it comes to this issue, I actually think people have just been lying all along, trying to get people to move away from what the actual issue is. Right now, we're about to start a series of biblical studies that look at some of the early stories in Scripture. And of course, when you look at something like Adam and Eve there in the garden, you get this crafty creature coming to manipulate them. And what is fascinating about the serpent there with Adam and Eve is he does not win by getting you to worship him. And this is the same with the book of Job, where you see Satan coming to try to get Job to curse God and die. He has a really primitive, crude desire for Job's body. Evil, oftentimes, it wants something gross like a body, a corpse. It wants death. But it doesn't sell it to you that way. both the serpent and Satan in the book of Job, they're not trying to get you to come and worship us. They're trying to get you to play a game which is not right. And with the issue of abortion, they've been trying to get people to have conversations about, well, let's talk about rape, let's talk about incest, because if people are having those conversations, instead of starting from the standpoint that life is sacred, we're created in the image of God. That doesn't mean we're all perfect little angels, but what it does mean is that there's something holy and sacred about life itself. So they don't want to have that conversation. They don't want to talk about the personhood of these infants. They don't want to talk about that. They want to move it to a distracting game, because that's how evil is. It doesn't win by confronting you head on. The serpent doesn't trick Adam and Eve into eating the apple by saying, look, I'm the new idol for you to worship. It tricks them by just getting their moral compass to move away from God and distracting them just a little bit so that it can slip in and bring chaos.
So it's interesting what you just said there. And I really enjoy talking to people like you, because I enjoy the Bible study type stuff to really get a good sense and get my hooks into understanding things a little bit better. And one of the things that you said there really caught my attention, which is that Satan is looking for like a body in a sense, right? And you know, the obvious difference between the Old Testament and New Testament and everything is that all of our sacrifices, the blood sacrifices, the food sacrifices and everything else that went in the Old Testament to God to signify us like sacrificing those things for him, was all taken care of by the blood of Christ in that exchange between the Old Testament and New Testament. So it's interesting to hear you talk about in this case Satan wanting a body and a sacrifice of his own in his evil doings then.
Absolutely. And you see, I heard an interesting statement once, and I've heard a few people reiterate this in various circles, and I'm not sure who the quote is originated by, but there's this idea that although evil does want to be the top of your moral code, it realizes that it can't actually be God. It actually can't care for a soul. It can't care for anything which has eternal, lasting meaning and value. So it settles for corpses. It settles for taking life. It settles for the curse. It realizes that it cannot create life in order the same way that God can. And the best imitation it can do is trick people into cursing God and dying. And with the story of Job, it is painfully old how old that book is. It is not the oldest. I just got done
reading through the whole thing with my daughter.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite books in the Old Testament. It's obviously, when you read it in English, it feels like it's something old that was translated into ancient Hebrew from some other mysterious language of maybe Phoenician origin. We have no idea where the book of Job comes from. As far as written texts go, it's much older than anything else. That doesn't mean the story is older than, say, Genesis, but as far as being a written document, it's extraordinarily ancient. It's painful to think about how old it is. And in that book, you get a very complex display of where there's a courtroom setup of this antagonistic thing wants to prove to God there is no good, there is no order to creation. You're only paying people to do that. And as God pushes back on Satan, the accuser, who is supposed to have no moral bearings at all. Satan is supposed to be this amoral thing walking to and from the earth. He just reports back to God, but yet he clearly decides to do wicked, even though he's wearing this facade of I have no morality at all. And there's some deep built-in lessons we can take from that. Things that claim to not be taking a stand, oftentimes they are, and they oftentimes are taking evil stands, as Satan is. And he can't actually do anything but ask for Job's body. And you see that in those first few chapters. He comes to God really twice, telling him if you'll lay your hand out, he'll curse you and ultimately die. You see that evil wants to win by going for that nasty, really primal, the sinews, the bone, the flesh, the guts of a person. It wants to have those things, and it wants to take those things away from God. It wants to take those things away from the sacred and to defile the sacred. And with abortion, you really do see a lot of really primal manifestations of evil coming along that you can't necessarily explain rationally, because these things do not want to work within a rational mindset. Back to what you were saying earlier with someone like the governor there, these were not the arguments they were making a few years ago. They tried to have some compelling argument saying you want to give rights to someone, you should let people decide. though, of course, they're injecting their own personal worldview upon others, even though they pretend they're not. But now that we've got to the point where they're no longer even trying to make the logical, compelling argument, they're just saying, if you want to kill a baby, kill a baby. If you want to execute one while it's out of the womb, go ahead, do it. They don't start.
And that's the next part that I wanted to talk about. In this regard, what they were trying to get away with saying and making excuses was that we're talking about like it was any better. I mean, it just at this point it's boggling my mind. And when I try to wrap my head around these things, it gives me a migraine.
Yeah.
But they're trying to make sense of when people started criticizing Governor Cuomo, they were basically saying, whoa, we're not talking about killing a baby outside of the womb or anything. We're talking about late-term abortions, meaning literally up to the point of starting to dilate. You could just decide at that point, whatever. Yeah. I don't want the baby and everything. And I even saw a tweet or some sort of Facebook post or something from, I don't know if it was a gynecologist or something like that, or OBGYN, I don't know. But they basically, it was a woman saying that in the case of a woman's health, that late-term abortions in the third trimester is typically done because of a woman's health and everything. But I have seen case studies that say that it's so extremely astronomically rare that you would get to that point that a woman's health would be at risk, that it's almost like at this point you would be able to circumvent that by doing a C-section or something like that and not going through with the birth and still being able to keep both lives intact. So leading into what you were talking about, though, so there's two videos, and I was struggling on which one I wanted to bring up first, because one is the logical conclusion to what we're looking at with where this is heading, the slippery slope, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
But yet it was done 9 years ago.
Yeah.
This video was made that I sent to you. And then the other one is this radio interview that the governor of Virginia, Northam, did just recently. I think it was last week, in regards to talking about post-birth abortion.
Right.
So let's start there, since that's what you brought up first, and then we're gonna time jump back and talk about how we constantly get made fun of for this slippery slope argument of where things are going to be going. We jump to these crazy conclusions of like genocide and stuff like that, and it's just absolutely nuts. But we jump back and we see how much it aligns up with Northam. So let's take a look at Governor Northam on the radio and talking about him defending some of these new policies real quick here.
So in this particular example, if a mother is in labor, I can tell you exactly what would happen. The infant would be delivered. The infant would be kept comfortable. The infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired. And then a discussion would ensue between the physicians and the mother. So I think this was really blown out of proportion.
Pastor Dillon, go ahead. What are your thoughts on what Northam was saying right there?
Well, I think Northam is actually being pretty honest. I don't think these people value life at all, and I don't think they ever did. I think this whole premise of we care for the marginalized is a prey upon people who still have enough of a moral compass that when they look at things like Scripture, they see sentences and verses within Scripture that will say something to the effect of care for the fatherless, the poor, the widow, the stranger. But what they often fail, these people who are using Scripture, they're using the name of God to a political ends, they fail to point out that when you see statements like that, usually within that same verse, you'll find something that says, also do not let people conspire to do evil against you. And there becomes a lot of moral confusion when you have someone who say, what if they are fatherless and they're devising evil? What if they're a stranger? What if they're a widow that's wanting to do something horrendously monstrous? And you see people in the past with this issue of abortion, they tried to use compelling arguments to take people away from any sense of moral guidance. They've tried to use emotional arguments to get people to shatter their moral compass. And they knew enough virtue to weaponize it. But in the church, we realize that just because you have been a victim of a tragedy, and people legitimately find themselves victims of tragedies, that doesn't allow you to be a monster. One of the things, speaking of Scripture, you see this interesting interaction where King Solomon is presented these two ladies who they're in a house of prostitution. I mean, not going to sugarcoat it. And so they've obviously, they don't have anybody to speak for them in society. They're in a really terrible place. And one of them loses her child and wants to steal the other child. And then when she gets caught, she's fine with that child dying too.
Right.
You know, just because you lost your own child doesn't mean you get to turn into a monster and have other people's children executed.
So interesting too, because that right there leads into one of my theories on the public stance on abortion. And I've been saying for quite a while now that I truly believe, beyond the sense of public education absolutely being the source of so much bad that's happening in our culture right now. Like when you think about what's wrong and why perceptions are wrong, you can really trace it back to the type of stuff, the content of what we're learning in public schools right now. And the fact with abortion is that it has been taught, at least since I was younger, you know, and why I was pro-choice when I was in high school, because you are taught not to think of it as a baby. It's just a fetus or a clump of cells. And they teach you that without going into what abortion is, showing pictures or even an illustration of how they tear the limbs off of these babies and then suck them out, and they like just the madness and evilness of it. They teach it as a form of birth control. If all else fails, this is your fail switch. You know what I mean? But then after that, where I was going with what you just said there, is the fact that I truly believe, beyond those people that have been indoctrinated by education, by public education, that a good majority of people in this world right now that advocate for abortion have either had an abortion themselves and are trying to justify it after the fact, or know somebody close to them that they love that had an abortion and have to justify their actions to show their love and appreciation for that person. And yet what I see in culture is I know a handful of people at least, and I'm sure more will come forward as I interact with them and everything on this, because I've become more and more outspoken on being pro-life over the last 2 years specifically. But what I have found is that the most steadfast and just amazing pro-life advocates out there right now are people that actually had abortions themselves and chose to analyze what happened to them, what they did, and then step forward and say, this is how it affected me, and this cannot continue to move forward the way it has been. And I think as a Christian nation, a Christian brotherhood and sisterhood under Christ, I think that's going to lead into part of the discussion we're going to have later on Chris Pratt and Ellen Page and everything. But I think we as Christians need to step up and, instead of damning those people, kind of take them under our arms and say, I get it. I understand that you did something that you regret now, and we will help you through that. And you are only going to become a stronger person in our culture, helping to spread this message with us going forward, instead of saying that person's evil, don't let them near the church, don't let them get involved in anything, when really they could be the keys to unlocking a whole other portion of Christ to society, I think.
Yeah, you cannot confuse behaviors and identities, and we'll come up to that conversation here a little bit later when we talk about the Chris Pratt thing. But we as the church, we have to reject a lot of the premises that we're thrown into. They'll come to you and say, well, this is a women's issue. And no, it's not. That's a lie. You will find overwhelmingly the people coming out of the woodworks to protest this are women.
Yeah.
They're mothers who realize the value of motherhood. And back to your point earlier, we see so many people who don't know what abortion really is, and even people who are working at places like Planned Parenthood. Recently, I was listening to an interview with a girl who had worked at a Planned Parenthood for a few years and had no idea what it was, even though she had been in the room while things were going on. It wasn't until she was in there and they used an ultrasound to help the doctor carry out the abortion, and she's seen a child. It was remarkably young. It was a lot younger than you would have expected to, and it was one that was trying to move away from the instruments that were coming in there to kill him. And she said when that happened, there was an awakening moment where she had to move away from that. And again, these people, they're not won by persuasive nice, compelling pieces of rhetoric, though language is one of the most powerful tools we have in our world. It really takes a spiritual transformation from these, because I'm not so sure that this is a mere political movement as much as it is an ideological and religious movement. Just because it's not branded as paganism doesn't mean that it's not paganism. Again, going back to those early stories, when Satan comes to God in the book of Job to wreak havoc and destruction, he doesn't brand this to Job to God or Job as saying, I want to be the new God. I want to be the new idol. All he has to do is get people to move away from their moral compass to start attributing things to God which are not of God, and to start attributing good to things which are not good. Once you have a false understanding of good and evil, then it becomes very easy for a lot of other evil things to happen. That's that slippery slope argument you have, and it's quite true. And so we've got to bring back the spiritual element to this. And yes, I'm a pastor saying that, of course, but there is an unmistakable religious element to this. And whenever we look at things like abortion, they a lot of times are sold. And I know you were talking about the school systems. It's not even so much the local teachers as much as the puppet masters trying to control. Yes. They have infected, and I know a lot of public school teachers who, well, some of them may be retired or near that age, who really oppose a lot of this stuff, but their hands are tied because there has been an infection in our culture that comes and it wants to move people away from having a moral compass that says we're created in the image of God, life is sacred, to something new. And while it's not always clear what that new is, it doesn't have to be in order for evil to win. That's the whole one of those built-in moral aspects of something like Job. The Satan character in the world does not have to come and say, worship me in order to win. He just has to get you to curse God and bring about death. And that's what we see going on in this issue. I don't think people like Northam, who they're being honest now, I don't think they were ever being honest in the past. I think they've just now got to the point where they're saying, yeah, we'll kill a child that's already been born. We're happy with that. Recently, I was first introduced to the language of comfort care, which is basically there's not many things which surprise me or really get to me anymore. And I was driving down the interstate listening to somebody tell about this, and they were talking about Gosnell and the movie that came out with him lately. And they were saying they didn't know what comfort care was because it sounds like a nice thing. And then when you find out it's basically taking a living baby and setting them to the side and just leaving them there to die, give them
which is what Northam is talking about in this video.
Give them a warm towel or something, make them comfortable. Like, excuse me, like that's not comfortable. That's hideously evil. And these people, their worldview is so wrong. They claim that they want to end suffering. And I think you've got to, in one of the clips that you have, there's a lady talking about, if my child is suffering.
Right. That's what we're going to play next. So hold on to that thought real quick before we get to that, because I want to take us down that road, that rabbit hole, so to speak, of just the moral fabric of society deteriorating with that slippery slope argument. But I think another point that you're kind of touching upon there is one that I also find interesting, which is this lack of respect for human life. And I say human life instead of just life, because how many of these same people are the ones that post something up on Facebook every day about adopt instead of breed for your pets and everything, or save this endangered species and everything. And really, when you take a look at specifically, like every group keeps on getting divided up into little subsections and everything, but I really think that a lot of this also has to do with the environmentalist group that views humanity as a cancer or a virus on the world that affects everything else, and that they really think that we need to diminish our populations either through sterilization in the water tables or water supplies and everything, as well as using abortion as a means for that, and just outright getting rid of people. I mean, that is their stated goal for a lot of things. If
I could step in, I want to throw something in there. It's really easy to diagnose issues, but really hard to give a proper prescription.
Right. Yeah.
And that's just the reality of it. You see so many times people like, well, that villain in like a movie. I recently watched Incredibles 2, and you see the villain saying things, and people are like, yeah, she's right. But just because someone can diagnose doesn't mean they can prescribe a fix. You do see this trend in our culture where people are like, well, if you don't have God, then people will be free to choose whatever belief system they want. And it's not true. Not true. With the environmentalists, they have a lot of religious language, and they've actually still have a very similar structure to the things that they want to reject. In Christianity, we do have this notion that while we were created in the image of God, there was a moment in the very early on setting of humanity where people engaged in sin. Adam and Eve sinned, and the state of humanity fell into a new state. And there is this default setting where people do sin. And I think with like the environmentalist, they have this notion, well, there's a version of original sin they have that says humanity is evil and therefore it must be destroyed. You see, with the Greeks, this idea that flesh is bad, that their worldview is all over the place. But there is this.
But they can't tie that to anything.
Yeah, they can't tie it to anything. Yeah, they can't. And instead of them having something to aspire to, there's no aspiration in their worldview. There's not this thing that you can overcome sin. You can overcome the chaos of life. In Christianity, we're not taught that you will not go in the darkest valley. In fact, if you look at something like Psalms 23, there's not even any indication that you may live to get out of the darkest valley. But what you are taught is God's rod and staff will come to be with you, and you'll have tools to guide you morally, and you'll also have something to give you comfort and consolation while you're in there. And ultimately, you will have eternal meaning beyond that darkest valley. And that darkest valley becomes something which will fade away with time, even as your physical body might. But for these environmentalist people, they don't know how to wrestle with any of that. They don't have a good enough, they don't have hope, they don't have aspiration. Again, they're taught that you're perfect kind of as you are, even though they say people are evil. But if you want to identify as something, or you're in some special group which claims victim status, therefore you're fine, you kind of get a pass. But yet humanity must be exterminated because it's evil. It's a lot of chaos. And I think it's because they tried to shatter something they did not understand. They tried to shatter the Judeo-Christian worldview. They tried to reject Christianity, and thinking that they could do that easily without realizing how complex it was, and without even realizing how much of it was woven into their lives.
Right. And yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Well, I'll throw that back to you. I can ramble about these things for I think.
Oh no, yeah, you're doing great. So, okay, so let's take it a step further. We just heard in that clip with Northam that basically he said, I believe he was did he deliver babies at one point in time? He was a doctor, I think. But essentially what he says, I could tell you what's going to happen in these cases that we're having a misunderstanding of. The baby will be born. It'll be put off to the side, and as you said, in a comfort care, right? And then the doctor and the mother, no mention of the father, will have a discussion on what happens from there, right? So,
if I can step in.
Yeah, well, real quick, what kind of discussion are they having, first of all? I mean, let's try to dissect this down to get rid of any false notions out there that this is not the kind of conversation that we're having. Because what other conversation could it be besides, is this baby going to live or die now that it's been born?
Well, if I can be perfectly honest, I think it's a lie. I don't think those conversations realistically happen.
No, I don't think so.
Large. And again, I'm not like a certified forensic psychologist, but in what I studied in graduate school was the idea of criminology, and I spent a good deal of my graduate school studying not only false memories, but how people structure lies and things of that nature. And you see with politicians, a lot of times they're not using any of the markers, any of the normal human expressions that would indicate they're actually talking about something they've experienced. And some of this is plastic. And again, I'm not here to give judgment on people. But when I see people make statements like that, and I've had enough people come into my office and want to tell me things that I definitively know aren't true, pretend like this is what goes on. You do have people who are depraved, and you are going to have somebody who says they don't want a baby. But there are other avenues, and there are other ways that manifest. Than just every time a child is born, the doctor goes in and quietly, using all nice euphemism and buzzwords, he comes along and says, well, let's have a conversation about whether or not this child lives, which is basically what the interview is suggesting.
Post birth.
Yeah, post birth.
Like the baby's out. It's alive. It's there.
Yeah, it's pathological that he would suggest that this is the normal human response to giving childbirth, is you want to have a conversation with the person that just delivered your child on whether or not that child lives. And first off, he says again, I have no idea exactly what he's done in the past in his life in the work he's had. But most of the ladies I know who have just had a child, well, they may have been on medication. They're not at their most rational point. Now, that's a dangerous thing for me to say in my position. But they're not. It's a beautiful moment, but it's also a moment where you just went through a pretty serious event and you're not your calm, collective. I think you see where I'm going with this. You're not at your most articulate time.
I think that I don't think you're treading sensitive ground, because it's kind of like saying, you pull a guy off the battlefield in the heat of the battle, and you bring him out and you start questioning about other stuff back home.
Yeah.
What's going to be his mindset right after a battle took place with bullets flying past his head? You're talking about, in essence, a stressful situation that they just went through with a physically stressful moment on their body to the extreme. I mean, there isn't many more things that are more extremely physical to your body than a woman giving birth and everything. A man can't handle it. There's a special structure to a woman to be able to do that. And no, I don't think you're stepping on crushing eggshells, I guess, in this case, in any sense. So
yeah, but people, they're not in a moment where they're, and it's emotionally wrecking too. And again, for people who've had their first child, hearing a child that's actually yours cry is different than hearing someone else's child cry. And it's not because you hate other children. It's just there's a new reality that, oh my gosh, this is my offspring. Oh my goodness. Like, there's life that has been derived from my own self. And there's something to that, which it takes people to a different place than they are in this sort of fantasy that they want people to think is how these conversations go down. And I just saying I don't buy it at all. I think it's a distraction.
Yeah, I agree with you. And also, it was just a couple of years ago. I'm not blaming this on President Obama, but during his administration, it was found out that there was a hospital, I want to say in Chicago, that was taking babies and putting them into like utility or closets or something like that, and leaving them in the rags to die. Post-birth, it was like a post-birth abortion thing. And the staff or nurses and doctors around the country came out and said, this is horrific. I think people that found out through any type of media that was covering it, and I don't think there were that many covering it at the time that found out, were horrified by it. And yet now we have the governor basically saying, yeah, you know what, this is the kind of conversation that we're going to have, whether that's an actual conversation that takes place or not. That doesn't matter to me, whether he's being truly honest about that conversation taking place or not. The horrific nature and evil of what is happening right there, on even the fact that whether a conversation takes place or not, this baby is outside the womb, and we're deciding whether it's going to live now or not.
Absolutely.
Is evil.
It is extraordinarily evil. And when you look at stuff like this, I think the best way to actually deal with the abortion issues, actually just to shed as much light on it as you can. Because there are so many people who they have bought into the sugarcoat language. They've bought in to the nice, we're having a decision to make. They separate the actual reality of it away from it. They want to distance themselves from the nastiness of this. But for many people, seeing the truth of it, it actually does reveal to them the horror and reality of this. But at the same time, and I have seen this in our culture, they're increasingly to the point where they do not care about the truth of it anymore. So it's strange, because you have this one group in society who is largely unaware of the reality of it. And once they see it, they realize that's not what we want. And yet you have another group in society who is largely infected politics and many other aspects of our culture that wants to pull people to the point and says, yeah, it is killing a baby, and that's fine. We're openly fine saying kill a baby. But I don't think most of the people in the West are actually comfortable with that when they see what is going on. I think there is enough holdover in our culture of people, even if they do not profess faith in Christ Jesus, there's enough holdover of people realizing there is something sacred about life that when they see it, they will turn away from it. So I think one of the best things we can do about this is to just shed light on it and to say, bring these people out in the open, because while not everyone will be compelled by that, because there are people who just hate the truth. There are people who want to sacrifice their children to Molech, not because they aren't aware that they're Jewish, but just because they want to sacrifice their children to Molech. There will be those people. But at the same time, for many people to see it for what it is, I think they will be moved.
Okay, so let's take it to the next step here. So, like I said, I think when during the passage of Roe v. Wade and up until the 2000s, let's say, I think that the view on abortion, except for the radical subsection group that we were just talking about there and everything, really did feel that abortion was necessary in some cases, but that it should be rare and safe. And that's why they were trying to support this type of legislation and everything. And I really do believe that a lot of people lined up, if they were pro-choice, with first term, early stages abortion, which, again, I completely disagree with, because as I've said it before in some of my other podcasts, if someone were to tell me that it's just a clump of cells, I would look at them and say, you're still just a clump of cells, just neatly organized by God. Okay. So there's never an excuse in my book, but we've moved from that to then in the 2009, 2010 time, there was a video that surfaced on YouTube. Okay. And it really raised the whole slippery slope argument. So let's take a look at that real quick.
No, and I think that if I were a mother of a suffering child, I would be the first to want, a deeply suffering child, I would be the first to want to put a pillow over its face.
Dr. Peter Evans
as I would with any suffering thing. And I think the difference is that my feeling of horror at suffering is much greater than my feeling of getting rid of a couple of cells, because suffering can go on for years.
I'm sorry, I was just about to introduce another guest there, but that's a pretty horrifying thing to say, that you would put a pillow over.
Of course I would, if it was a child I really loved who is in agony. I think any good mother would.
That's going to cause some shock amongst people.
I don't know any mother who wouldn't say that if there was nothing else that could be done, and it was
just not true.
Do you think that mothers would agree with you?
I think a lot would. Maybe not any, but a lot.
All right, Pastor Dillon. So what we're seeing in that video there is this woman on British television sitting with a priest. I guess you would be, right? It appeared to be to you, or no?
Yeah, I wasn't entirely sure.
Yeah. But yeah, she's sitting there and she's basically saying the topic of abortion was the topic of that show. But this woman is saying, as a mother or as a person, I just can't fathom the idea that you wouldn't want to smother your child with a pillow if they're suffering from something that you can't help. At this point, she's talking about not a baby sitting on the delivery table. This woman is literally talking about and defending, more than just what I just said right there, the idea that you could have like a 13-year-old child in your care that's yours, and if the boy or girl has some sort of disease or disability or something and they're suffering, that as a mother, she feels it would be very loving to put a pillow over that child and smother them to death. And it raised the question at that point that a lot of people would look at me, and I've talked about this video in the past, and that's why I brought it up to you. It raised the idea of this slippery slope argument that the other side would say, we're never going to get to that point. We're talking about first term abortions here and everything, not killing a child that has grown outside the womb or anything. Yeah. And yet we jump ahead in time and we see Cuomo celebrating late-term abortions up to and including dilation and partially being born, and Northam at the same time down in Virginia talking about the death of a baby, leaving one to die on a delivery table. Is this not just the next logical step in that chain to through the terms of abortion, partial birth, and then children at that point?
Absolutely. And there's a huge worldview problem going on here, because the lady that makes that statement, and it's interesting that there's not only pushback from the other guests, but actually the host recognizes that people aren't really ready for this.
Right.
And again, this is in the Western culture, most mainstream publications, they have a bias that tends to be against traditional values. That's just kind of how it is. But this lady who says this, her worldview says that there is a goal in life that is admirable to avoid suffering. And that's just absurd. If you look throughout human history, where have people got this notion that life is to avoid suffering? In the church, we are told that, if you pick up the cross and follow Jesus, there's a good chance that you also will find yourself on a cross. The whole story of the book of Acts, we see the early churches, they're finding themselves to be people who walk as Jesus called them to it, even though they clearly haven't got that sorted out yet. They're still learning what it means to be, but there's an unbelievable amount of suffering that they incur very quickly. If you look at the first few hundred years of the church, they experienced a lot of death and martyrdom because of their faith. And even before Christ, all the way throughout the Old Testament, going all the way back to Adam and Eve, once they have sinned and they enter into this fallen state, I think one of the reasons that they feel shame is not just because of their actions, but they also feel shame because now that they have knowledge of good and evil, they are not equipped to deal with the suffering of the world. When you don't have clothes on, you can't walk through a bushel of thorns. You're not going to survive very long in the wilderness. You have nothing to protect you against the cold, nothing to protect you against the heat. You have nothing to allow you to survive for very long. And the purpose of life is not to escape suffering. Nowhere do we find this in the call of the people of God, that God says, if you would just eradicate suffering from your life, as if that's even possible, then somehow you will attain holiness. That is not the pathway towards Christ likeness, nor is it the pathway towards the holiness and glory of God, to just escape suffering. There's much more to life than that. There's more meaning than that. And for this lady, Well, I was just saying, for this lady to sell the argument that you are doing something virtuous because you have ended suffering, there is a time where ending suffering is the only way that you can bless. So there is a case to be made that, say, you've got like a dog or something that is sick, or even people make difficult decisions when they have someone who's on life support and they're going to pass anyway, and they don't want to draw out that. There are times where people wrestle with that, but it does not look anything like what that lady suggested it does. It looks nothing like that. And again, she's being fraudulent in pretending that is how those situations look. The loss of a child is quite possibly the most horrific suffering that I think people can experience. And when people are faced with that, it does not look like, oh, I'm going to do something virtuous because I don't want them to suffer. It looks like painful, darkest valley. But I'll throw things back to you.
Well, I find it interesting because I don't want to get off the abortion topic too much before we end that. But the question for non-Christians or puzzled Christians as well is always, we're watching Soul Surfer last night. I don't know if you've ever seen that. The girl in Hawaii that was a surfer and got her arm bitten off by a shark. Yeah, sure. And she is a Christian, and even she at one point broke down and said, why would God want this to happen to me? Why would this be part of his plans and everything? And I think that's really what you see is a lot of people taking this very single lane approach to the Bible of, if I have faith in God, if I have faith in Jesus, that everything is just supposed to be an easy path for me moving forward, that if I run into any type of obstacle, then obviously this is a sign that there isn't a God. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And what I was thinking about as you were talking there with all the suffering in the Bible and everything is you see Moses walking through the desert for 40 years with these people trying to lead him to the promised land, but because of their actions, even he is not allowed to get to the promised land and can only look upon it from a distance and say, even as a servant of God is not allowed to get to that promised land. And that is a form of suffering to me. What David went through, Solomon, what Job went through, what Jonah went through. I mean, the Bible is literally story after story of men's faith being tested by suffering and sacrifices that they have to make. And it's the ability to hold on to that faith and make it through and realize that God will bless you in the end through that suffering and take those circumstances and make something of it. I mean, just as an example, I wasn't very big into watching that movie in the first place last night. It was the first time seeing it, and it's been out for a while now. But essentially, what did I get from that? I got the sense that girl who then went on to compete still in surfing and do phenomenal with it with only one arm, with the help of her father modifying a surfboard to hang on with one hand and everything, is a sign now to kids everywhere that having faith in God can work miracles in your life and you can still be a champion.
Yeah.
Through that suffering and everything. And another thing to your point as well is you were talking about the early days after Christ, and I think you were talking about Acts specifically, that these people were figuring out very quickly that, if you follow Christ, you're going to be running into the annihilation of people and everything. And that in and of itself, to me, the days following Christ, before it was, I guess you could say, called Christianity and everything at that point, shows what a miracle it is that Christianity not only survived but thrived after that, with so many people being hunted down in those circumstances. That in and of itself is a miracle.
Yeah, and for that point, Christianity is either one of two things. It's either entirely insane or it's entirely true. And that's basically, there's not many things in the world which are set up in this sort of dichotomy or some sort of actual straight choice where there's only A or B as an option. But there are some things which are like that. And with Christianity, it's either totally insane or entirely true. And when you go back to that, there are people who come with that question and say, well, if there's suffering in the world, how could God even exist? And, the greatest sacrifice that could ever cover for sins is actually God giving up not his elected son, but his begotten son. And I don't know why suffering happens and why it would affect the innocence of children and why people's children might die. But God knows what it's like to lose a child. And basic tenets of Christianity is Christ actually dies on the cross. Not that he's mostly dead, but he's actually dies and he goes to the abode of the dead. This is the concept of Hades. He actually goes to the realm of the dead and comes out victorious, and in doing so redefines both life and death. God actually sent his son to die, and God shares in the suffering of humanity and did that so that we could have a new definition of life and death, and we could have something to aspire to. That's the one of the beautiful things of our faith, is that there is hope and there is something to aspire to. And I'll talk a little bit more about that after we discuss the deal with Chris Pratt.
Sure.
But,
yeah. How about this? Any final thoughts on the topic of abortion and what's going on now before we move on?
Shed as much light onto it as we possibly can, and don't play the games. When people sell things to you that are blatantly lies, and this is how evil tends to work, it doesn't have to get you to decide one thing or another in order to win. Sometimes just playing the game at all allows for it to win. The best thing I think we can do with abortion is shed light on it. And as people are exposed to the truth of what it is, there are other things going on in their mind which will help convict them. And again, make this a matter of prayer. Inspire the we've got to do.